Oh, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent and looking at the history and current affairs of each nation. We're still in West Africa, and we now explore the West African country of Ghana. And who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our returning champion, the brilliant historian and journalist and anti-imperialist activist Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire, and also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports, who will be our guide on this trip to Ghana's history. So first off, Abayomi, welcome back to the program.
Yes, thank you so much for your ongoing interests and efforts to document the history and contemporary affairs of the African continent.
Well, likewise, Abayomi, it's always an honor to have you on the program. And as always, folks, please share widely One Plus One's content. Facebook is still limiting how much I can share and post. We've had some better days, but still, it's very important that people to please share widely across your social media and emails and so forth. As always, donate generously to Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. And also donate generously to us and help us overcome the far right algorithms. Now, before we talk about Ghana, Abayomi, as everybody knows, because I posted on my YouTube, and when I was sharing my two interviews with Rania Masri and Joe Emersberger, we weren't able to cover Ghana last week because you were at a very important event. You were at the People's Palestine Conference. I believe that was the title of it, and yeah, well, briefly, if it's even possible, just tell us what was it like at the conference? Any particular speakers that you really liked? Did you come out feeling much more optimistic about Palestine solidarity as a movement and the liberation of historic Palestine? Uh, yeah, very curious overall your impressions and whatnot.
This was the second annual People's Conference for Palestine. The first one last year drew a huge crowd from all over the United States, from Canada, and even internationally. This year was an estimated registration of some 3,000 people. A lot of them came from across the US and Canada. And it was a very inspiring, and it was very good in terms of networking. Some of the people who were there included Aweda Haraf, who lives in the Detroit metropolitan area. She's a Palestinian American. She was on the recent flotilla, the Handala,
Yeah,
and they were, of course, stopped and detained. Also, Chris Smalls, who was the founder of the Amazon Labor Union, former president of the Amazon Labor Union, was only African American on the flotilla, and he was arrested as well and beaten and roughed up by the Israeli Defense Forces. So it was also Mahmoud Khalil, who was detained by the United States government. He was a spokesperson for the encampment at Columbia University during 2024, which was violently broken up, like many of the other encampments across the United States. He was
it was.
detained for several months under the Trump administration just for being a spokesperson for the Palestine Solidarity Movement at Columbia University. There were dozens of vending tables. A lot of them had literature on the history of Palestine and contemporary affairs. Then there was others, like the 1804 books out of New York City that sells publications dealing with African affairs. There was a book on Niger that was being distributed there. There was also the Michigan Coalition Against Genocide, Michigan Divest, the Michigan Jewish Voice for Peace, and the Moratorium Now Coalition, the Anti-Fascist Organizing Coalition. All of these groups locally were in the same aisle. I staffed a table for the Moratorium Now Coalition, and we had a tremendous outpouring of interest in our work. We had pamphlets on the history of the Palestinian question, the history of Zionism, pamphlets that I had written on the Malcolm X centenary, the interrelationship between the abolitionist movement and the movement for women's suffrage. We had pamphlets on China, the Ukraine war, and how it's a proxy war of NATO and US imperialism. So it's very interesting. They also had cultural presentations. One of the most interesting aspects of it was a exhibit that was put together. In fact, in our building, in our headquarters here in Detroit, um, it was an exhibit of Gaza. They were attempting to map out Gaza prior to the intervention of the British and the Zionists, and also to look forward in terms of what an independent Palestine would look like. This was a huge display, and I have photographs of it, which I have posted and will post more on Facebook. So it was a very inspirational gathering. We were able to network with a lot of people from across North America and just met a lot of interesting people. Like there was a woman there who lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is about 45 miles, maybe, what is that, maybe 60 kilometers from Detroit. It's a major university town. University of Michigan is based there. She was 84 years old. She's Palestinian, and she was displaced by the Nakba, and she wound up in East Africa, the East African state of the United Republic of Tanzania. And she said her daughter went to school in Tanzania during the late 1970s and 80s, during the period of the Chama cha Mapinduzi, which was previously the Tanzania or Tanganyika and Tanzanian African National Union, headed by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. And she had nothing but praise for the Tanzanian political system, for Mwalimu Nyerere. She also talked about the radical and revolutionary intellectual history of the University of Dar es Salaam during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that was quite an interesting discussion. And she also did her PhD dissertation on West African literature. So she's very well acquainted with both former British and French colonial outposts in West Africa, people like Chinua Achebe and many others who were, of course, literary and cultural contributors under colonialism and then later under the post-colonial period. So it's a very, very interesting affair, and hopefully it'll come back again next year. But who knows what the situation is going to be within a year from now. We've seen people arrested, people deported. Who knows? They may try to ban the conference next year. That would definitely have an extreme response in this area. The Detroit metropolitan area has the largest concentration of people of West Asian ancestry. A lot of Palestinians, people from Lebanon, Iraq, and these are not just Muslims. A lot of them are Christians. We have Chaldean, Iraqis, and Syrians who are Christians, but at the same time, they lived in countries that have been under attack by US imperialism. So it's very, very interesting conference.
Fascinating, and hopefully that does happen, and hopefully the censors, the state censors, don't do don't do that to a future conference. But we do have to be we do have to be very much prepared for anything that can happen. For anything that happens. I mean, look what happened with Palestine action in the
In
Brits and
Britain.
so forth. And I know for a fact. Just the demographics you laid out. That's definitely why. Hopefully, the conference happens again. I certainly would love to get the chance to go there if given the chance. And I know there's going to be a big. It's called ArabCon, a big convergence of the Arab American diaspora. I believe Rania Khalek is going to be a speaker there. Ali Abu Nima of Palestine of electronic intifada. And although I have my issues with the Young Turks, Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian are also going to be there. A lot of people who watch OnePlus One are huge fans of of TYT, hence why I'm mentioning that.
Right.
And although I have my issues with Mehdi Hassan, he will also be there. And I'm very curious to see if there's going to be a bit of a scuffle and a bit of a debate going on, because while he is somewhat great on Palestine. He has some very problematic views when it comes to the issue of imperialism, attacking the axis of resistance like Iran and so forth. Cenk and Anna tend to be very loyal to the Democratic Party and so forth like that. So it'll be quite interesting to see if there will be any public debates or scuffles going on between that, and I'll make sure to link to that in case our American viewers or international audience are interested and want to attend there. And
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that Al Jazeera did cover the conference. It's fairly decent.
and
I think
Breakthrough News as well. And if anybody wasn't even able to attend the conference, Breakthrough News more or less covered all of it, and I'll also make sure to link to that. And I can't wait to take a week off of 1+1 to just binge watch all of it. So
yeah, and Electronic Intifada, I saw Nora Friedman and Nora Barrow Friedman, who's one of the co-hosts of Electronic Intifada. I wasn't able to talk to her, but I did see her on several occasions there. And I talked to the correspondent they had there from Al Jazeera. So anyway, it was pretty interesting event and well worthwhile. And the amount of interest in the work that we're doing here in Detroit was enormous. I was quite quite taken aback, But the thing is, we've worked for years with the Palestine community and the Solidarity Movement. As I mentioned, the exhibit was put together in our offices in the Midtown area of Detroit. Got a lot of praise from the Palestinian Youth Movement, Students for Justice in Palestine, the United States Palestinian Community Network, the Nakba Survivors Association. So yes, we want to continue that work, that solidarity work. It's essential during this period.
And one last question before we get to Ghana. I had to ask this question, and we might even have to do a whole other a whole show on this, hopefully with Rania Mazuri and Dimitri Lascaris, hopefully Manar Adley of Minpress News if she's able to join. And that's the issue of the democratic secular one-state solution, which I definitely endorse. I think most of the guests I've had on this program more or less also endorse it. Some certainly much more passionate than others about it. Do you when talking with a lot of the folks of Palestinian descent or those who are allies to the Palestinian cause who do solidarity work, when the issue of the democratic secular one state solution, is that something that is very much in a unanimous agreement in the Palestine solidarity movement amongst the Palestinian community, or is that an issue where people don't really want to talk about it much? Because I know there still is an issue with there are still some shockingly who are advocates of the two states delusion, even amongst Palestinian leadership. Although I think we can sort of push aside, Fatah and the PLO, but still, I think it's one of those topics that we can't, that we should not ignore, and we should not assume that most people are on board with it, given the opportunism or just the misguided nature that some people have, thinking that the two-state solution is the only solution and is the only way forward. So I'm very curious. I'm very curious your response on that.
It depends. You still have people, a lot of them, who come out of the Palestine Liberation Organization and its auxiliaries, that tradition of the Palestine national movement, who still advocate for a secular, unified Palestinian state. Nonetheless, a lot of people, even though they don't agree with Hamas, still recognize it as a vanguard movement at this point, particularly in Gaza, in the struggle against Zionism and imperialism. I think that'll have to be worked out by the Palestinian people. And that cannot, in my opinion, be worked out as long as they have the boot of Zionism and US imperialism on their necks. If Palestine was granted its independence and unity, the people could debate and they could work out a solution going forward in terms of a unitary state, whether it's Islamist or whether it's secular, or it could be a combination of both. And what's interesting, is that the whole notion of Islamicism or Islamist organizations has taken a different character with the rise of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the so-called axis of resistance, being the Ansarullah in Yemen, the Hezbollah party in Lebanon,
Yeah.
the former government in Syria of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party under Bashar al-Assad, and also other Shia-oriented movements in Bahrain and other places. So I think it needs to be worked out among the Palestinians themselves, among the resistance and progressive forces throughout West Asia and North Africa. And hopefully they'll come to an equilibrium where you have Christians, there are a lot of Christians, Palestinian Christians, Christians in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Those people will have to be brought into any new political dispensation that occurs. So I think the major issue right now is to defeat the Zionist occupation. And after that's done, the other things can be worked out through negotiations and political struggle.
And that's exactly why the BDS movement is important, and why I don't know why it continues to not really truly advance as it should. We're very good at protesting. I think we're very good at getting many people onto the streets and protesting the Holocaust that's been going on in Gaza recently, and just in general since the Nakba. But in terms of actually advancing BDS, I think little victories here and there, but not enough major victories and not enough advancement. And given the state of the Israeli political mindset, although there are some honorable exceptions in Israel who are disgusted with what their government is doing, also believe in a democratic, secular, one-state solution. But I know for a fact, from Max Blumenthal to Miko Peled to Gideon Levy and so many other, Israelis of conscience and Jewish anti-Zionists, they all say a version of the following: that there is no changing Israel from within, and that it really is up to the international community to engage in, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and also the demand that historic Palestine become a secular, democratic, one-state solution. Or as my friend Dimitri Lascaris, also an advocate, says the following: if Zionists don't want to accept that, if Zionists do not want to accept living side by side with their indigenous people, then if they want to move out of historic Palestine, let them do it. Only problem is
yes.
that means that we have to deal with more far-right people within our own communities. But hey, a price to pay for liberating
Exactly.
Palestine.
It's inevitable.
All righty. Okay, let's get underway. So, folks, find a comfortable chair, because now we are going to talk about Ghana. So, Abayomi, as always, my first question: what was Ghana? What was Ghana like before British colonization? And when England colonized Ghana, what were the conditions? What were the conditions of the people like?
That region of West Africa has a long, honorable history. We're talking about a different area than what we talked about before when we talked about the ancient Ghana Empire, which was further to the north. Although some of the people and ethnic groups from modern Ghana also have their origins in areas of the ancient Ghana, Mali, Songhai empires. In terms of Ghana itself, the modern day Ghana, they had civilizations and kingdoms that can be traced back all the way to the 11th century and even before. There was kingdoms of the Dangoba, which were located in the modern area of modern day Ghana. Also, another major kingdom which emerged beginning in the early 18th century was the Ashanti Empire. The Ashanti Empire became a formidable force throughout the area known as modern day Ghana, but also beyond that. Um, a lot of these groups and kingdoms, you cannot compare them strictly because the Europeans, when they arrived, they redrew the geographic boundaries. So you have people in, for example, Burkina Faso, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, which were part of some of the traditional civilizations and kingdoms that is in the area that is known today as modern day Ghana. The Ashanti existed as a strong kingdom and civilization for more than 2 centuries. And it was interesting because they fought a monumental series of wars that lasted approximately three quarters of a century between 1824 and 1901. But we have to go back as well to look at what happened during the latter part of the 15th century when the Portuguese arrived in the area, and it was later named the Gold Coast, and began to engage in trade with the indigenous peoples. They were the ones that built the first so-called slave castle at Elmina. Now,
Yes.
there were other castles that were built later and trading forts by not only the Portuguese, later the Dutch who were there from the Netherlands, the Swedes, the Danes, and then later the British. So it was a whole series of colonial powers which intervened in that area. Initially, they said they were involved in trading. However, they began to work out deals where prisoners of war from various groups in the region were taken and then sold into the Atlantic slave trade system. This began as early as the late 15th century and continued all the way up through the 19th century, even after the British had outlawed slavery, the slave trade in around 1806, 1807. It still continued illegally, even after the beginning of the 19th century. Now, we could talk about the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, which began around 1824. The first war, the British were routed. They were overrun. They were killed. The British military governor for the entire region of West Africa, a man by the name of McCarthy, did something that the traditional peoples of that area considered horrendous. And they attacked them, overran them. McCarthy was beheaded by the Ashanti people, the Ashanti warriors. They had 5 other wars with the British, all of which they were able to prevail, except the last one, which occurred around 1900. It was led by Ya Asantewaa. She was a woman warrior. After facing 4 wars, some people began to become weary. The current leadership of the Asante at that time were not willing to take the action that was necessary to confront the British. She challenged them, and she said, we'll fight. If the men won't fight, we will. So she mobilized an army of at least 5,000 soldiers, and they went after the British. What happened was that the British governor at that time, they wanted to seize the golden stool of the Ashanti, which had more symbolic value, but for the British, it had monetary value. And Ya Asantewaa condemned them in a speech, a couple of speeches. We really don't have time today to quote from them, but people can look it up. She was very clear what the purpose of British colonialism and expedition was. It was to rob the African people of their natural wealth, to exploit their labor, and also to go after their traditional symbols. So they were looking all over the place for this golden stool. And even after the war, the Ashanti gave them a replica of the stool, which was fake. And the actual golden stool was not found until maybe 20 years later by some construction workers working on behalf of the British colonialists. So it was a monumental effort on the part of the Ashanti and other peoples in the region to resist British colonialism. And this proves the falsehood that Africans never resisted enslavement or colonialism during this period. There were numerous wars that were fought And more information is being uncovered about this gallant resistance history on the African continent. Remember, weeks ago, we talked about what happened in Equatorial Guinea, for example, in Gabon, places that today have relatively low populations, but that's due to the colonial divisions that were enacted during the period of enslavement and colonialism. So, yes, these people retreated into the mountains. They developed their own weapons. They secured weapons from European powers to fight against the colonialists. And that shaped what became known as the modern independence movement in Africa, which reached its fruition during the mid and late 19th century. So, yes, the people in Ghana, the Ashanti, the Fanti was another major language group and ethnic groups, combination of ethnic groups in Ghana, as early as the 1880s, had their own organizations. They developed their own constitution and political program called the Fanti Federation, and they put forward demands to the British. But the British were not concerned. They only wanted the gold, the agricultural products, and access to the waterways in Ghana. So they began to construct rail lines and other infrastructure, but it was not done for the benefit of the African people. It was done to enhance the exploitative character of British colonialism. There was also divisions that were brought about. You had the French, which were in control of Cote d'Ivoire, and so-called Upper Volta, which is now Burkina Faso. And they also divided British Togoland from French Togoland. So it was a very, very interesting period. We're talking about the 19th and early 20th century on the African continent.
Fascinating. And of course, very briefly before we talk about how Ghana became independence, the conditions of the people, very exploitative, a very cruel system, and a lot of sectarianism, which the British themselves developed in Ghana. No different from other African countries, or
yes, this was widespread, and the whole notion that British culture and civilization is superior traditional African culture was ingrained in the education system and also within the labor market itself. So, yes, this notion that European civilization is superior to African civilization was part and parcel of the psychological warfare and the imperialist propaganda that was imposed by the people through the economic class orientation and later through education and the cultural apparatus as well. What's interesting about this area when you study it is that the people moved around. You have people in modern day Ghana who have their origins in areas further north, the Soninke people, the Mande people. They were also in Ghana as well. So it's interesting when people do DNA analysis. Even Africans in the United States who have been here for generations, they'll find that their DNA encompasses people, let's say, for example, in Nigeria, in Ghana, and Cameroon, but as far south as Angola, and as far south as South Africa, and even to the east, because people traveled and they intermingled. And also, the slave trade was also very, very instrumental in the development in East Africa and Southern Africa as well. Jan van Riebeck, who was the Netherlands explorer and slave trader, landed in South Africa in the Cape Coast, in the Cape region, the Cape of Good Hope, in 1652. He brought with him a number of enslaved Africans from other parts of the continent. So yes, the notion of tribal origins or tribal affiliations is something that has to be examined very critically, because you had people, for example, people involved in trade from West Africa further north of what became known as the Gold Coast were also present in the area of the Gold Coast, largely due to trade and interrelationships that existed centuries before. So it's a very, very interesting project to look at the history of the so-called Gold Coast, which later became modern day Ghana.
Okay. And perfect segue into this question. So, how did Ghana become independent? Was it was it a peaceful transition or one of violent struggle? And then tell us, because I have so many questions about Ghana, and then tell us about the nation's early years under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, and how do you assess his legacy?
Well, the trade union movement there can be traced back to the 1920s. The Railway Workers Union was one of the first organized labor groups inside the country. They were fighting for better wages. Later, you had unions that formed in other sectors of the economy, some affiliated with the Trade Union Congress in Britain. And so there was resistance through strikes, work stoppages, and sabotage, all during the period between 1902 all the way up to the period after World War II. The modern independence movement, which began around 1947, when Dr. Kwame Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast from England. Kwame Nkrumah was born around 1909, somewhere between 1909 and 1912. And he was from the Nzima group, which had some affiliation with the Fanti. He attended primary school in Ghana. He also attended the Ashimoto College, Teacher Education College, and graduated, began to teach primary school in Ghana. In 1935, well, prior to that, he wrote Lincoln University, which was the first university to specifically train African Americans in the United States, back even prior to the Civil War. They admitted him. He went to a neighboring country of Nigeria where he had a relative living, and he was loaned money to board a ship to come to the United States. He studied largely in Pennsylvania between 1935 and 1945. This was a critical period in world history, but also United States history. He arrived here during the height of the Great Depression, and he wound up working in railroad yards as a domestic. He worked. He tells a story in his autobiography about how he and a friend of his had an idea to become fish salesmen on the street. Didn't work out. They wound up falling out. He made contact with some very, very important people in the United States. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which was formed by Marcus Garvey. Now, this was after Garvey had been arrested, framed up, imprisoned for 2 years, and deported back to Jamaica. Had been involved with them in Philadelphia. He also was involved in the Council on African Affairs, which was formed by Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois during the late 1930s. You can get some of his early writings that he put out in an educational journal in 1941, 1943. You could see the radicalization occurring and building. And a lot of that had to do with his experience in the United States. He gained undergraduate and graduate degrees from Lincoln University and also the University of Pennsylvania. He was also certified as a clergyman. Now, he had gone to a Catholic school even back in the Gold Coast, and even had thoughts, he says in his autobiography, becoming involved in the priesthood, but he did not do that, luckily enough. And in the early 1940s, he participated in conferences that was held by the Council on African Affairs, and he was also involved in the struggle around fighting racism inside the United States. He was certified as a clergyman. He spoke extensively on numerous occasions in African American churches in the Northeast. So he was pretty well known as Francis Nkrumah during that particular time period. So in 1945, he traveled to London, where he was admitted to the London School of Economics there. But he was so involved in agitation around the liberation of Africa that he never completed his studies doctoral studies at the London School of Economics. He was involved in the formation of the Pan-African Federation in London in 1944. That prepared him to participate as a leading force in the Fifth Pan-African Congress that was held in Manchester, England in October of 1945. There was also a World Federation of Trade Unions conference, founding conference that was held as well in London just earlier, prior to the Fifth Pan-African Congress. George Padmore, W.B. Du Bois, Jomo Kenyatta, and Kwame Nkrumah were all leaders in the Fifth Pan-African Congress that took place in Manchester in October of 1945. If you read the documents from this conference, you'll see it prefigures the political program that guided the national independence movement after World War II. So he continued to work in London, continued to work in the UK, and then in 1947, he was summoned back to the Gold Coast to participate in what became known as the United Gold Coast Convention. This was an independence organization, somewhat moderate in comparison to events that occurred 2 years later. But he was set up as an organizer for the United Gold Coast Convention. Now, Nkrumah, based on his studies in the United States and in Britain, saw the necessity of a mass organization that would serve as a vanguard in the anti-colonial struggle. Soon enough, he fell out with the United Gold Coast Convention. He formed, while in the UGCC, a group called the Committee on Youth Organization. This was key because he was able to mobilize young people, so-called school leavers, people who had graduated, from primary school and what would be considered middle school. In those days, somebody with an 8th grade education was considered fairly educated, even here in the United States. So the CYO began to go out throughout the cities, the towns, the countryside to mobilize people for an independent struggle. In 1949, there was a meeting of the United Gold Coast Convention. I believe it was at Salt Pond in the UGC in the Gold Coast. And they didn't want Nkrumah to speak. A lot of the leaders, like J.B. Danquah, who was a major political figure at that time in the Gold Coast, didn't want him to speak. So the CYO, the Committee on Youth Organization Leaders, came into the conference and pretty much drug Nkrumah out. In June of 1949, they announced the formation of the Convention People's Party, with tens of thousands of people in attendance at that first mass rally. So it was a major development. But in 1948, you mentioned the question of violence. The servicemen who had served in World War II were not getting their bonuses that were promised them by the British. And they held a march in 1948. And at that march, instead of talking with the people who had served British imperialism during World War II, the British police opened fire on them, killing numerous people. And after that happened, the country exploded in rebellion for days. The top 6 leaders of the United Gold Coast Convention, which included Kwame Nkrumah, were arrested. And Nkrumah, in his autobiography, says that the other leaders, who were much more moderate than he, began to attack him, saying his rhetoric, his actions inside the Gold Coast was responsible for them being detained. So that was a lot of friction there. So in 1949, after the CPP was formed, even prior to that, they formed he developed a newspaper called the Evening News. You know, it was started out as a broadside, one-sided, two-sided paper. And it was really a powerful vehicle. So having studied Garveyism, he said that the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey had fueled his imagination. He had studied Marx, Lenin. So even in 1945 through 1947, when he was in England, he wrote a book called on colonialism, Towards Colonial Freedom. And in that book, you can see he's analyzing imperialism from a Leninist perspective. So he was accused of being a communist, even by other forces inside the UGCC. But after the CPP was formed, they were able to act freely in terms of mobilizing and organizing people throughout the country. They went to the farmers, they went to the youth. Women were instrumental in building the Convention People's Party. Traditionally, and as a result of colonial influence, perhaps they thought that women were not key in the independence struggle, but Nkrumah knew better. So he even recruited Mabel Dove, who was a wife of J.B. Danquah. It's probably had a lot to do with the tensions as well that developed between the CPP and the UGCC in later years. They were so effective that in early 1950, they called for a general strike, which they described as positive action. And the strike took place. The British were quite disturbed by this, and they came and arrested Nkrumah. He says in his autobiography that they took him out in a rural area, and he didn't know whether they were going to shoot him in the back of the head and dump him. They put him in prison. He stayed there for approximately a year. Under the Cowsey Constitution, which was like a reformed constitutional initiative after World War II, similar to what the French did. We talked about the Conference of Free France in Brazzaville in 1944. The British had similar initiatives. They realized that after the war, they would not be able to rule their colonies in the same fashion. So they wanted to bring in Africans who they considered reputable as part of their governance process.
And they wanted to do with Ghana like what they did with Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia, what they've done with Gibraltar, what they've done with the partition part of Ireland and other territories. Britain still because Britain still has some overseas colonies, and they basically kind of wanted to do that with Ghana.
Yes, and they wanted to maintain their political and economic dominance, and Nkrumah and the CPP were not having it. Now, when this election took place in early 1951, the CPP won the largest block of votes, so they could no longer be ignored. So they agreed to release Nkrumah from prison and make him, quote, leader of government business. So this began the transitional process. So the CPP leaders ran to the jail when he came out. Thousands of people greeted him. They put him up on their shoulders. They have pictures of this, and they marched him through Accra, the capital. He became leader of government business. That took place between 1951 and 1953. There was another election, which was part of the whole transitional process. After that election, Nkrumah became prime minister around 1954. Then the British wanted another election, which was held in 1956. The CPP won that as well. And as a result of that, they ran on a pro-independence platform. As a result of that, Nkrumah, the British agreed to relinquish control of the Gold Coast, and Nkrumah became prime minister of an independent Ghana on March the 6th of 1957. Now, this independent Ghana was still part of the Commonwealth system, and they were still considered a British dominion. But of course, the CPP had other ideas. Immediately at the independence ceremony on March 6, 1957, in that famous speech, Nkrumah said, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total independence of Africa." So he made it clear right there that we're not unique, we're not special, we're part and parcel of a continental movement for independence and liberation. And after that, of course, in 1957, 1958, he called for a first conference of independent African states. And it was only 8 countries that showed up that were independent. And that put Ghana in the leadership of the African independence movement and the struggle for Pan-Africanism. Later that year, in December of 1958, he called for a All-African Peoples Conference, which was held in December of that year, that brought together 62 African nationalist organizations. And Patrice Lumumba was there. Frantz Fanon was there as an envoy of the FLN in Algeria. In fact, after that, he became a diplomat or an envoy for the FLN in Accra, Ghana. So you could see the importance of what he was doing. After Lumumba returned to Congo, the Belgian Congo at that time, rebellions broke out in early 1959 across the country. I mean, people could feel independence in their path. And of course, Lumumba was arrested, tortured, and so forth. And 1960, what happened then? And we know the story, the undermining of Congolese independence, the kidnapping and torture of Lumumba and his eventual execution, the sabotage of Congo. Nkrumah, Secretary Modibo Keita, and Patrice Lumumba had a plan to build a Pan-African bloc across the continent. So in 1960, Ghana became a republic where they had a parliament, and Nkrumah went from being prime minister to president, and they had Republic Day, July 1st, 1960. And then right after that was the first conference of African women and women of African descent that took place in history. It was held right in Ghana. It brought hundreds of women from various parts of the African continent, even from the United States. Women traveled there to participate in that conference. Shirley Graham Du Bois, the second wife of the late Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, he was still very much alive at that time, spoke and delivered an address at that conference, which is still available. You can find it in documents that are hoisted online.
And
so Ghana was positioned. Go ahead.
Talk to us about some of his left-wing. Talk to us about some of his left-wing policies, which you think, when we talk about his legacy and we assess his legacy, we should celebrate some of these left-wing policies that he championed as president.
Well, the whole notion that Africa is one entity, this is very, very important. This is what he advanced. Then the idea that the movement should move away from imperialism and towards socialism. These are key elements. Also, the organization and mobilization of the workers, the farmers, and women. The CPP, many described it as a, quote, party of women because they had such strong support among the women. They played an instrumental role in mobilizing Ghanaians during the period of colonialism and even after to vote and support for the Convention People's Party. The market women at that time were very progressive, and they helped get out information. They were able to raise money for the party. So yeah, it was very, very important. And then around 1961, we saw a marked shift towards the left in Ghana. At the same time, the resistance to his administration grew as well. They did everything they could to undermine what the CPP was doing in Ghana. Now, the people who came, who were involved with the UGCC, eventually formed, after independence, formed what they call the United Party, but they really weren't united. They were only united around their opposition to socialism and communism and to Nkrumahism. That was the only basis of their unity. Because politically they were extremely reactionary. So yeah, that happened. And then in 61, Nkrumah had been awarded the Lenin Peace Prize. He had an extensive tour of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. At the same time, in September of 1961, we had the outbreak of a number of strikes inside the country because of some tax changes that Nkrumah had made. And they had to break the strike. And Komla Badema.
Talk a bit more about that. Actually, talk a bit more about that. So he introduced a tax and
yeah, which they felt had a negative impact on the masses in Ghana. And the workers went on strike, and Nkrumah was out of the country. He left and came back into Ghana. He had left Komla Badema, who was a strong ally of Nkrumah, strong organizer during the anti-colonial struggle. And he and Nkrumah had a difference over how to address this crisis. And eventually he left the government, Badema, and wound up in the West. In fact, he even testified at one point before the US Congress against Kwame Nkrumah. Very tragic situation. So then in 62, there was another crisis because there was an assassination attempt on Nkrumah at Kulungugu, which is in the north on the border with today's Burkina Faso. Several people were killed, and Nkrumah was injured, slightly injured, but he survived that attempt. There were other assassination attempts. In 1963, they bombed a rally which commemorated the anniversary of positive action. That was in 1963. Numerous people were killed. There were assassinations of CPP members. And then in the early 1964, there was yet another assassination attempt against Kwame Nkrumah while he was leaving Flagstaff House, which was his office there in Accra. The culprit was captured by a very, very important military officer, and Nkrumah went uninjured during that time period. Now, there was an election. Well, first, let's go back to 1962, where they advanced the Program for Work and Happiness. It was a 7-year plan for the construction of socialism in Ghana. Then in 1964, there was an election to create a one-party state in Ghana. So after 1964, Ghana was considered a one-party state. Nkrumah moved forward with the plan to build socialism. There were 600 industrial programs that had been initiated by Kwame Nkrumah, where people were producing their own goods, whether they're agricultural products, industrial products. Then there was the idea of going through with the Akasambo Dam, Volta River project in the east. It had first been advanced by the British. They backed away from it. So Ghana, under Nkrumah, took it up. And when Nkrumah came to the United States in 1958, he met with Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he said, yes, we need support from the United States to build this dam so we can help further electrify the country, so we can further industrialize. Eisenhower sent him to a man by the name of Kaiser, who owned Kaiser Aluminum. And they worked out a plan to build this huge dam at Akasombo. And the dam was completed on February the 1st of 1966. And just 3 weeks later, the Nkrumah government was overthrown. So the whole idea that Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown by the military and the police is really a misnomer. They were the ground troops that did it. But if you study the documents that have come out since then, if you listen to the interviews of top Central Intelligence Agency figures of the period, this coup was carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency in the lead. It was also supported by other imperialist countries like Britain, as well as Canada. So how was Nkrumah overthrown? He was overthrown in a military coup d'etat that was engineered by the US Central Intelligence Agency. He left the country, I believe on February 22nd, headed to Vietnam in a plan to negotiate a peaceful conclusion to the US genocidal occupation of South Vietnam, and of course the bombing of North Vietnam. Today they're both unified. That was the purpose. And he had already contacted the US President, Lyndon Baines Johnson, about what his plans were. This is while the US had been secretly bombing North Vietnam. And Johnson assured him he would do nothing to interfere with his trip and his mission, which was a lie. So as soon as he left the country, they put this whole plot into operation. It was called Operation Cold Chop. And it involved troop movements by sections of the Ghanaian military and also elements within the Ghanaian police. They told the soldiers that Nkrumah had abandoned the country. He had looted the national treasury, and that he was going to send the troops, Ghanaian troops, to fight in Rhodesia because he had actually broken diplomatic relations with Britain over the Rhodesia question. There's a book called The Rhodesia File, which contains a lot of documents and articles and speeches by Kwame Nkrumah calling for the reversal of settler colonialism in Rhodesia. So the question of Zimbabwean independence is closely linked with the coup in Ghana that occurred in February of 1966.
Fascinating. Okay, so you already explained what led to Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow, which was one of my questions. But now, is it say? Okay, before I get to this big question, just answer this yes or no. Is it safe to say that Kwame Nkrumah was not a democratic socialist like, say, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo or Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the twice elected president, twice overthrown president of Haiti?
No, I don't think he was a Democratic. So perhaps at the early phase between 1951 to 1957, he had to moderate his policies. Yet it's quite clear after 1960, 1961, that he was a Marxist-Leninist, and that even the Soviet Union said in 1965, when he issued this seminal book, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, and the Soviet government praised the book as a major contribution to Marxist theory. The Ideological Institute at Winneba, which was formed around 1961 at Winneba, which was a fort that was established by the British, trained cadres from the CPP and other national liberation movements in Africa in revolutionary theory. This went on for about 5 years. So yes, I would say if you go back and read the newspapers such as the Evening News, the Spark, the Ghana Times, a lot of which now have been digitized and put online, or you can find them in archives at various university libraries. And also the Moreland Spingarn Center at Howard University. It's clear that they were proponents of socialism and Pan-Africanism. They saw no contradiction between revolutionary Pan-Africanism and scientific socialism and Marxism-Leninism. They had developed good relations with the Soviet Union and the Comecon countries, with China. Nkrumah visited China in 1962 and met with Mao Zedong. Zhou Enlai visited Ghana in 1964 and met with Nkrumah, where he made that famous statement, Africa is ripe for revolution. So yeah, it's no question about it. If you go back and read the literature and also the state-owned corporations, 600 industrial projects were developed between just a 9-year period in Ghana. So it was a very, very interesting and fascinating period. The last industrial project was the construction in 1965 of the conference center in Accra. And that was done to host the OAU summit that was held in late 1965, which was boycotted by a number of conservative and right-wing political leaders in Africa. But that center, when it was first opened in late 1965, was more fabulous than the United Nations headquarters in New York. Go back and read the documents of Dr. Shirley Graham Du Bois. Her correspondence with her attorney in New York City are all housed at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And these documents are online. In fact, I utilized them for this book that I published 9 years ago on the role of women in Nkrumah's Ghana. So it's absolutely amazing, this history. And at that summit, as I mentioned, the Western imperialists put pressure on the neocolonial dominated states to boycott it, because Nkrumah was calling for an immediate movement towards a United States of Africa. He said, we cannot wait. And most of the other countries did not agree with his position. Even Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who was president of Tanzania at the time, did not agree with the regional, he more agreed with the regional approach as a stepping stone to continental unity. But later, interestingly enough, he went to Ghana long after Nkrumah's death and overthrow and apologized, saying, I didn't understand at that time the significance of what Kwame Nkrumah had advocated back during the 1960s. 1963, Ghana played an instrumental role in the formation of the Organization of African Unity. I mentioned the All African Peoples Conference, which held three different meetings between 1958, again in 1960, 1961. 1962, that was a conference of African freedom fighters in Accra. A speech from that is also available online. So it was really a fascinating period in African history.
Well, that's fascinating. And before we talk about Ghana after Kwame Nkrumah and the series of military dictators they had, that okay, answer this. So, is it safe to say that the system he was building was semi-democracy, one that you can compare to the Tanzanian model of to the Tanzanian model of African socialism, or the system Thomas Sankara was trying to form? Because some critics argue that Tanzania is not a democracy, while others say it's the best model of democratic socialism, and some argue that Sankara was not a democrat, but what he was trying to advance was needed, and adopting the Western liberal democracy model that has its severe limitations that we don't even have to even talk about. I mean, that's plain to see, and those do not meet the needs of the majority poor and destitute Africans. So how do you respond to that, and then how do you assess Ghana under Nkrumah, and how do you even respond to his liberal critics and his leftist critics? And the reason why I ask that is because I was watching a documentary about Nkrumah that CGTN, Chinese,
Global Television Network, yeah.
Yeah, but I was quite disappointed by the documentary. It was quite critical of Nkrumah. I thought it was very one-sided and didn't give enough room for people to actually articulate well why it was right for Nkrumah to abandon multi-party democracy and have a one-party African socialist state. So with that all being said, very curious your response.
Yeah, I haven't seen that documentary, and I love the China Global Television Network. They do have a tendency to hire people who are not socialists and who have a reputation in journalism in the West. So that could have been attributable to such a situation, because China today is essentially a one-party state, still committed to socialism. We saw just 3 days ago the huge 80th anniversary Victory Day commemorations in Beijing. I mean, it shocked the world when they looked at it. The level of preparedness, military preparedness, the political unity of the country, the commitment to advancing socialism. Even Xi Jinping, in his address, mentioned Marxism, Leninism. Mao Zedong thought the three represents. Deng Xiaoping thought. All of that was mentioned as a coherent political trajectory for the People's Republic of China. So no, I don't think he was undemocratic at all. If you look at what happened after his overthrow by the so-called National Liberation Council, Nkrumah called them later in a series of broadcasts from Radio Conakry, the voice of the revolution, as the notorious Liars Council. And there was a book published called Voice from Conakry, which was a transcription of those speeches that were held. Those speeches were given between March and December of 1966. Very interesting. His research assistant, June Milne, had been a British, Australian activist. Her husband was involved in the publishing business. They had published a number of Nkrumah's books up until the coup d'etat. And then the British publishing company did not want to publish any more of his work. They thought people would not be interested in him. So he wound up forming his own publishing house called Pan-Af Books. And it was headed up pretty much by Jules Milne. She's since passed on several years ago, but she was very close to Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, did editing and proofreading, worked for him tirelessly to get his work out. He published a numerous books and pamphlets after the coup d'etat in 1966 while he lived in Guinea. Voice from Conakry was the broadcast that was delivered between March and December of 1966. Then you had the Challenge of the Congo, which he had worked on prior to the coup. That was published. You also had Dark Days in Ghana, which was his interpretation and his reflections on why his government was overthrown. Then there was Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, which he had been working on prior to the coup. That was published around 1968. In 1969, they did a revised copy, an issue of Conscientism, which he had initially published in 1964. And in 1970, the book Class Struggle in Africa was published, about a 96-page book that talks about the class structure of Africa. It talks about the military, the police, civil servants, the petty bourgeoisie, the role of imperialism in fostering neocolonialism. So he was a prolific writer. And after he was overthrown in February of 1966, he thought about where should he go next. He went to Guinea-Conakry, which, of course, they had formed a union with in 1958. And when he arrived, they had a big ceremony, and Secretary announced that he was being appointed as co-president of Guinea.
Yes, yes.
Which had never happened. You know, I've never seen this happen up to that point, and even until now.
So,
and,
so when I prepare an episode, because we're going to do an episode about Guinea. So when I prepare an episode about Guinea, Kwame, we'll be talking about Kwame Nkrumah again then.
As well. You know, all the way from 1958, when Guinea struck out on its own, rejecting the loyal cadre of Charles de Gaulle. They ripped out telephone wires. They took furniture out of offices. They tried to destroy Guinea-Conakry after they voted against the French neocolonial scheme. And it was Ghana under Nkrumah that loaned Guinea 10 million pounds, which was about, at the time, maybe $25 million, which was a lot of money at that time to continue their operations. So Secretary, the president of Guinea and leader of the Democratic Party of Guinea, the PDG, was grateful to Nkrumah and his actions that kept them afloat after 1958. So he went to Conakry, and Secretary announced before tens of thousands of people that Kwame Nkrumah is not just the president of Ghana. He is going to be my co-president. So when he got there, he was able to write and publish extensively, meet with foreign leaders, and lay out a plan for his future activities. There were several attempts to bring him back to power. One was in May of 1967, where some junior army officers attempted to stage a coup d'etat. They killed General Atoka, who was one of the coup makers from the National Liberation Council, but it was not successful, and these young men were executed. And then there were other efforts, particularly in 1969, which were also thwarted. Around 1971, Nkrumah became ill, and he was taken to Bucharest in Romania, and he underwent cancer treatment, but it was too late, and he died on April 27th of 1972. Now, after he was killed, there had already been another military. What happened in Ghana was that they had a military government in 1966 to 1968. They held elections. The CPP was banned from even participating in the elections. And then the party that won was composed of people who were in the opposition under the CPP.
And that's quite fascinating. And so actually talk to us about that. So talk about Ghana after Kwame's overthrow, where there was a series of military dictatorships. How do you assess that period for Ghanese people, and what led to the rise and brief government of Hila Liman, who was actually part of the far left party that seemingly champions Kwame Nkrumah's visions of Pan-Africanist leftism.
Yeah. Yeah, well, first of all, they reversed all the policies of Nkrumah. They repudiated revolutionary Pan-Africanism. They were anti-communists, and they shut down a lot of the state industrial projects, saying they were wasteful. They were dens of corruption. They had hearings in Accra where they brought all these people to testify that Nkrumah and the CPP were corrupt. So it was a very bad period in Ghanaian history.
And is that why, sorry to interrupt, but is that why the idea that Nkrumah was this dictator who lost his way,
corrupt,
and that
womanizer, all those things. All those were CIA concocted propaganda tropes, and it came out. Well, it was always suspected that the CIA was behind the overthrow of Nkrumah, but in 1978, a headline story in the New York Times said, "quote CIA responsible for the overthrow of Nkrumah." 12 years later, they had to admit that they were behind the coup d'etat that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. So those people in Ghana, in the military, the right-wing opposition, the police, and so forth, were patting themselves on the back for ending tyranny under the First Republic and the CPP, led by Kwame Nkrumah. It was clear. They didn't act on their own. They would not have been able to carry out that change of government without the support and coordination of the CIA and other intelligence agencies. The State Department issued declassified documents years later, spelling out the whole process of destabilizing the government and overthrowing it. But yes, it was very right-wing for many, many years in Ghana. The people that took over in 1968 were people who had been part of the opposition against the CPP. And then it was another coup in January of 1972, just 3 months prior to Nkrumah's demise. And when he died in April of 1972, the government then under Achiampong was his name. He was a military officer, wanted to bring Nkrumah's body back to Ghana for a state funeral. And Secretary Ray said, wait a minute, you have to meet certain conditions, that they have to pardon Nkrumah of all the fake charges that were leveled against him. And he had to be at least recognized as the founder of the leader of the country. So when he was brought back, there was not a state funeral, but they did have a funeral, and they did have a ceremony at his birthplace, and that's where he was buried initially. Now, he was eventually exhumed and brought back to Accra, where they set up a monument for him. But yeah, this went on for years. There were military governments, which were largely right-wing, between 1966, a brief period of right-wing political control between 1968 and early 1972. And then in coups and counter coups. Yeah.
So what led to the rise in the brief government of Hillel Aliman, who actually was part of the party of Nkrumah, and later Jerry Rawlings, who we're going to talk about after you respond to this question.
Well, in 1979, was uncovered that there was a plot to overturn the existing military government in Ghana, because there had been a lot of protests and a lot of unrest inside the country. Jerry Rawlings was put on trial, accused of treason and so forth, but the people rallied behind him, and he wound up becoming the leader of Ghana in 1979. He turned the country over to have a multi-party election. Liman was elected under the guise that he would reinstitute Nkrumahism as the dominant political ideology and system in Ghana. They didn't go nearly far enough, and the economic conditions continued to worsen, and Liman was overthrown in early 1982, again by Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings. He took over again, And he talked
Interesting. That's so
in 79 when he took over, he executed some of the generals who had been involved in the coup against Nkrumah and who had been involved in subsequent governments under the guise of corruption and repression and so forth. He did this, but then in 1982, he overthrew the Lamont government and became leader. He talked really tough for a period of months, that they were going to, institute reforms that would reverse some of the corruption that had been going on inside the country. They did negotiate a better agreement surrounding the Volta Dam project with the Kaiser Aluminum Corporation. Nonetheless, by 1983-84, Rawlings and his government had succumbed to imperialist pressure. They accepted what they called.
In fact, sorry to interrupt, but okay,
Go ahead.
So that's fascinating. That's very fascinating. So you already talked about what led to Jerry Rawlings, who overthrew a government who was leftist or supposedly a left-wing government in power. But Rawlings, because of conditions, people demanded more radicalism. So that's how he gets into power. So he gets into power through a military coup. So Rawlings, before you talk about his assessment, I think it's very important to note the following. So he was in power from December 1981 to January 2001. How do you assess his time in office? And also important to note, his party, the National Democratic Congress, is at least on paper, is a social democratic party. They are members of Socialist International and Progressive Alliance, but also very important to note, both SI and PA are led and dominated by Western social democratic parties who were always supportive of imperialism, but in recent years, especially since the 90s, have pivoted to the right on socioeconomics affairs in the last 2 decades, and even African members and others from the global South often, govern, as right-wingers as well. It's important to point that out. So with that being said, talk to us about Jerry Rawlings and how do you assess, how do you assess his legacy?
Well, like I said, they were able to renegotiate the terms of the Volta Dam project, which was very popular. However, by 1983, 1984, they accepted the International Monetary Fund, World Bank scheme of the Economic Recovery Program and later Structural Adjustment Program. So what does that involve? It involves large-scale layoffs within the public sector, including education, the devaluation of currency. So Ghana actually went further than any other country in Africa in accepting these conditionalities imposed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And this went on between perhaps 1984 all the way up to the early 1990s when he relinquished power. He formed what was known as the NDC, and they continued to govern the country off and on for many, many years. They're back in power right now in Ghana, that same party.
So,
but they had to accept the IMF World Bank program, which was devastating for Ghana.
Well, that explains in a lot why there still is grotesque levels of poverty in Ghana, even if they did have a left-wing government in power. Correct?
Yeah, supposedly left-wing under Rawlings, and then his successors that took office during the 1990s, the 2000s, all the way up to the present time. But you have this trade-off between the legacy of the UGCC of J.B. Danquah, the president who just left office. He served 2 terms, was actually the son of one of the people who were involved in the anti-imperialist movement. So Akudo-Addo, his father, in fact, was a former prime minister or president under that transitional period between military rule in 1966 to 68. After that, the anti-imperialist forces, after banning the progressive forces, took control. But they had no program for the country, and you still had continuous military coups. So, yeah, since that time, even though the CPP has been allowed to function independently, function legally inside Ghana, they still have a party there, but they have never been able to gain mass support, and they have never been able to retake power. So you have the tradition of the right wing, you have the tradition of the CPP, but in between there, in my opinion, exists the National Democratic Congress. Now, they've taken some of Nkrumah's ideas and incorporated it into their program, but it's being done, in my opinion, on a more opportunistic level. So you have the current president there now, John Mahama. He was in office prior to that. He's back in now. So we'll have to see what happens going forward in Ghana. There's about 35 million people there now. The country is a central element in the African diaspora, particularly those in the West. It's a centerpiece for tourism. In 2019, they had the year of return. Thousands upon thousands of people from North America and the Caribbean traveled to Ghana to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the beginning of the U.S. involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. I mean, it was in existence before that. 1619 is when the British brought 20 Africans from Angola to the British colony of Virginia.
So it's fascinating what you were just saying about Jerry Rawlings, because he's often celebrated.
Yeah.
Jerry Rawlings is often celebrated as this great left-winger, as this more acceptable left-winger that everybody should be celebrating. And again, if you watch the CGTN documentary, it's mostly pretty positive about Jerry Rawlings. And guys, this is why we do a show like 1+1. We have Abayomi on to challenge even some of these popular narratives. So that's fascinating.
Just to give you one example.
Yeah,
I read an interview, and this may be online, with Rawlings. He was saying that he remembers when Nkrumah was overthrown, and that, quote, he had never seen so much joy and celebration throughout the country, unquote. So he's justifying a military seizure of power when people are dissatisfied with civilian governments and subsequent governments too. Nkrumah is no longer, his image is no longer outlawed, and they've even built a memorial park in Accra in his honor and so forth. But none of the governments, whether the right-wing party of the NPP or the more centrist left party of the NDC, has reinstituted his policies of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, scientific socialism, or any of that. This is definitely, I feel, is the accurate description of what is happening in Ghana and has happened over the last nearly 6 decades.
Yeah, no. In fact, the one documentary I saw about Nkrumah, which I already expressed, I was very disappointed by CGTN. Rawlings says that, and then in the documentary that CGTN has about Jerry Rawlings, which is mostly positive about his legacy, he continues to say that, kind of ironic, given that he's supposed to be, this leftist and so forth. So it's interesting that you mentioned that he shamefully accepted IMF structural adjustment programs and World Bank junk economics, so he steps down from power, and in the 2000s, and in the 2000s, Ghana was no longer ruled by Rawlings or his party. The right wing made a comeback, not through military means, but by democratic means, whatever that means. How do you assess the legacy of John Kufuor or Kufuor? Apologies, folks, for butchering his name. His party that you mentioned, the NPP, the New Patriotic Party, is a right-wing party, very right-wing. They are members of the International Democratic Union, which is where all these center-right parties, I call them far-right though, which is where all these right-wing parties gather globally to set a global right-wing agenda and see how they can help one another out and mobilize their movement. Stephen Harper former Prime Minister of Canada of the Conservative Party of Canada, leads this
Yes.
group, and also a member of the Liberal Party of Australia is second in command. Kufuor's party is a member of the African regional base of the IDU called Democracy Union of Africa, whose headquarters are in Accra, Ghana. So, Abayomi,
Yes.
all that being said, how do you assess his legacy?
Very conservative. Uh, he seemed to be a nice man, but the policies were definitely pro-Western, and the economy has not recouped to where it was under the Nkrumah CPP leadership. So it's been a battle, as I mentioned before, between the NPP and the NDC over the last 2.5 decades. And there seems to be stability inside of Ghana, but at the same time, they're very vulnerable in regard to the economic situation because they're still so very closely tied with the West.
And in 2012 to 2017, the NDC, the supposed left, made a comeback. How do you assess the legacy of John Atta Mills and his successor and member of his party, John Mahama?
Yes, the policies were more social democratic oriented, but they did not go far enough in regard to the nationalization of key industries. Oil began to be produced there during this particular time period, so this helped the economy. Yet there's been strikes on the part of Ghanaian oil workers unions demanding better salaries and better working conditions inside the country. So yes, Ghana is part of the economic community of West African states, which today does not have a sterling reputation due to the fact that they threatened to invade Niger just 2 years ago and expelled members of the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES. And after they formed the AES, then they wanted to invite them back into ECOWAS, which they have refused. But there's still a lot of progressive forces in Ghana, socialists, people who speak out, against the economic policies. They even played a role in speaking out against the ECOWAS plan, which was really a U.S.-French plan to invade Niger after the July 26, 2023 revolution that occurred there, and when they joined in with other AES states, Mali and Burkina Faso, which is the former Upper Volta. So yes, the country appears to be more stable, yet it's not clear exactly what the outcome of all of this will be, considering the world economic crisis that's being imposed right now under
And that,
Trump. Yeah.
yeah, and after 2017, the right wing MPP made another comeback under the leadership of Nana Akufo-Addo, who governed from 2016 to 2025 of this year. How do you assess his time in office and legacy? Yeah, go right ahead.
It was many aspects were disastrous. For example, when he won the elections initially, he paid tribute to former Ghanaian leaders, and he never mentioned Kwame Nkrumah. He mentioned his J.B. Dankwa, who he said was his uncle, and his father, who was also Nana Akufo-Addo. Yeah, he mentioned him, but he did not mention Kwame Nkrumah, not even a whisper. So a lot of people were upset about that. Now, under his government, they did build that Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Park, and they don't appear to be as hostile towards the Nkrumahism, but still, there's this big division within Ghanaian politics. I consider it three different schools of political thought. You have the NPP, which is a direct descendant of the UGCC leadership and the United Party. You have the NDC, which came out of Jerry Rawlings and other social democratic leaders. And of course, the CPP, which still remains a minority political tendency inside the country over the last 2 decades.
And talk to us about Ghana's current affairs. So the country is governed currently by the NDC and it's led by John Mahama. once more. How do you, how do you assess their time in office? How do you assess
Mhm.
their time in office so far?
Well, the country has remained stable, somewhat prosperous, but there's still a lot of poverty inside of Ghana. They have become a center for tourism, not only in West Africa, but throughout the world. African Americans have always had a fascination with Ghana. Under Nkrumah, of course, he had an open door policy to Africans from the West. People like W.B. Du Bois was appointed as the director of Encyclopedia Africana, that project. He was invited back there to live in 1961, 62. He was made a citizen of Ghana because we'll probably have a whole nother episode on how they wound up there.
Yeah,
Uh,
no,
he and his wife,
yeah,
he and his
yeah.
wife had their passports seized, and W.B. Du Bois, at 80 or 81 years old, was indicted by the federal government for being a foreign agent of the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. They set up the Encyclopedia Africana in 1962. Later, after he died in Ghana in 1963, his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, was made director of Ghana National Television. This is a pioneering project. You're talking about 1964 and 1965. They built this huge television network. The Japanese played a role in terms of technology transfers there. Uh, in her letters and private papers, she talks about how she traveled to Tokyo, and people were very receptive of her, and she was able to get some of these Japanese companies to actually build Ghana National Television, which opened in 1965. Monumental effort, but then the Osage-Fu was overthrown in 1966. So the television network became almost a non-event. They were using it to denounce Nkrumah and so forth. So yes, the point that African Americans, African Caribbean, people in Africa from other part of the continent during the period of Nkrumah and in the current period were welcomed in Ghana. And now there are thousands upon thousands of African Americans living there. They have their own association, they have their own clubs, businesses, restaurants, and so forth there. So it's become a mecca once again for the African diaspora. That's one positive thing that has developed even under the NPP as well as the NDC.
And can you talk to us about what has been Ghana's relations with Western imperial nations like the UK, the US, Canada, France, and Western Europe? And during the Cold War, what was its relations with the USSR and Eastern European socialist blocs and others like China, North Korea, and Vietnam? You already sort of answered that a little bit, but if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, under Nkrumah, they developed very close relations with the Soviet Union, with Cuba. Che Guevara even visited Ghana in 1965 in preparation for his Congo campaign. Also, for the development of the Tricontinental Congress that took place in January of 1966, and which led to the Organization of Solidarity for the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So Ghana played a role in those developments. And Nkrumah was also a co-founder of the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961, along with Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, Sukarno of Indonesia, and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. He had a very, very close relationship with Nkrumah. In fact, Nkrumah married a woman from Egypt.
Yeah.
And it was, in a way, many people say it was a political marriage because they were trying to link past the division that had been imposed under imperialism, sub-Saharan Africa and Northern Africa, which was really a false division, but that's what imperialism does. And in that last OAU summit in 1965 in Accra, Gamal Abdel Nasser was there. All the progressive leaders in Africa were there. They were set for the formation of the United States of Africa. That would have been the headquarters, and of course, the coup d'etat took place, and they've never been able to recover after 59 years. So yes, you have to break it up into two phases. The Nkrumah's phase, very close to the World Socialist Movement. The military phase, they reinforced their dependency on the Western imperialist countries, be it the United States, Britain, and the others. But today
And
they have very good relations with China and Russia as well, because some of those tensions have subsided. But we don't know what's going to happen in the future.
I have to ask this question: does Britain continue to have strong influence on Ghanese affairs and exploiting the country for its domestic demands and neo-colonial ends? And historically, how did Ghana get along? Well, actually, you've well, okay. I'll still ask this question.
Okay.
uh, Historically, how did Ghana get along with other African nations during the Cold War and post Cold War worlds,
Mhm.
and what's been its response to the anti French, this genuine African Spring that's happening mostly in Western Africa, as well as the efforts of the U.S. and its allies to maintain a stranglehold on Africa through AFRICOM.
Well, in regard to affairs as it relates to unity with other African states, under Nkrumah, he got along very well with Mali, with Guinea, and other African states, but some were hostile towards him, because they were influenced by Western imperialism. The slander against him is that he wanted to be president of Africa, that he was training rebels to send into countries that he didn't agree with politically, to engage in guerrilla warfare and to try to prompt changes of government undemocratically. These were all the myths that were circulated about him. And of course, yeah, he got along good with the socialist states. With the United States, initially, there was efforts, as I mentioned, his trip in 1958, where he met with Eisenhower, and they agreed to refer Edgar Kaiser in regard to developing the Akosombo Dam project. But other countries in later years, including the United States, had a very hostile approach to Nkrumah. In fact, G. Menon Williams, who was the former governor of the state of Michigan, who was appointed as the Undersecretary for African Affairs in the State Department, was the one who wrote a protest letter after Nkrumah published Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. So G. Menon Williams played a critical role through the State Department in creating the atmosphere for the coup d'etat of February of 1966. And oftentimes people don't make that connection. I met G. Menon Williams once. He was part of the Kennedy administration. I met him once in 1984 at a reception for some Nicaraguan jurists. This was during the period of the initial rule by the Sandinistas. And at that time, I was working for the National Lawyers Guild, which is a radical, left-wing lawyers association in the United States. And G. Menon Williams was invited to this reception for these Nicaraguan jurists. So when I walked in, he was sitting down, and this guy, he was a very prominent lawyer. He's just recently deceased, and he introduced me. He said, "This is G. Menon Williams." The guy looked up at me, and he shook my hand like he already knew me. It was really an amazing experience.
And it's that because
it was in 1984. I was still in my 20s, and he looked up and shook my hand like he already knew who I was.
Interesting.
It was funny. I don't know when he died, but it probably was not too long after that. But yeah, Ghana, 35 million people, tremendous prospects. They still have a lot of gold. They still have aluminum, no, bauxite, which can be turned into aluminum, and oil, the oil industry, which has developed over the last decade and a half. So tremendous prospects for the country.
Interesting. You already talked to us about Ghana's relations with BRICS, and so far, very good, particularly with China and Russia. But we'll see, depending on if Western imperialism sabotages it. That leads to my final question, which is the following: does Ghana have a strong left-wing movement? And any final thoughts do you want to share about Ghana? And do you think if Ghana really This is really the most important question. And do you really think that if Ghana really wants to overcome major poverty and certainly eradicate it, it needs to go back to the roots and system that Kwame Nkrumah was building, have that system, or even adopt a combination of Nkrumahism with the Tanzanian model, the Thomas Sankara Burkina Faso model, arguably the Eritrean model. And with that, very curious response.
Yes, I think they should readopt Nkrumah's socialism in Ghana. But I think that has a lot to do with the strength of the left inside the country. There still is a left there, but doesn't appear to be dominant. And that is the problem in my view. So I think that, for example, Kwesi Pratt Jr., whose father was head of the Trade Union Congress under Nkrumah, who was an Nkrumahist, he still has a group called the Ghana Socialist Forum in Ghana. People can look up his work online, even on YouTube. Talks in a very articulate and very persuasive manner in defense of the Nkrumah's legacy within Ghana. He talked about the destruction that was carried out after the February 1966 coup at the aegis of the military and their backers, within the CIA and the U.S. State Department. So yes, there needs to be a revival of socialism in Ghana and revolutionary Pan-Africanism in order to move forward.
And do you think? And well, actually, two bonus questions that I want to ask. Is it safe to compare Kwame Nkrumah and the fact that he was so quickly overthrown? I think he served 5 years when he was president, and then he was overthrown.
Well, 1951, he was made leader of government business. 1957 was independence, and then he was overthrown in 1966. So his influence was about a decade and a half, about 15 years. Now, the independence was in 1957. They became a republic in 1960. So in terms of actual independence, he ruled for approximately 9 years, which is a short period of time in regard to politics. And the fact that he was able to achieve 600 industrial projects, build a new conference center, which would have served as the headquarters of the United States of Africa. And even today, his name is still heard throughout the country and throughout Africa and throughout the world. I mean, who remembers Kotoka and Afrifa and those people? Nobody even knows who they are. All right, J.B. Dankwa. You have to be a scholar almost to recognize his name. So despite the setbacks, which continue, Nkrumah, his legacy remains very strong.
And do you think if Nkrumah does have left-wing critics, whether they are in Africa or or globally, like the West and so forth, do you find that those criticisms are unjust because of the fact that Western imperialists are so good at sabotaging, they're so good at infiltrating unions and the press and so forth like that, and even making believe as like when Nkrumah was overthrown and Jerry Rawlings says that stupid comment that there was celebrations. Isn't that one huge psyops that the CIA and its allies do to make it seem as if Nkrumah was very unpopular? And you can compare that to Salvador Allende when he was
yes, in 73.
Yeah, when he was in power, or Jean-Bertrand Aristide, both times when he was president of Haiti, correct?
Yeah, they're able to do that. You get opposition forces, and you finance them, you coordinate them. The demonstrations that were held, which Rollins says proved that it was the most joyous period in the history of the country. A lot of those demonstrations were orchestrated by the U.S. Embassy in Accra. The signs that they were carrying, saying down with the dictator and all this kind of stuff, was engineered. The propaganda in the West. Ali Mazrui played a role in that. The Kenyan scholar wrote an article that was published widely called Nkrumah, the Leninist Czar. This is in 1966, even published in Ebony magazine. So
I know,
he later
yes,
regretted.
and I
He
know
later
Extreme
regretted
Magazine,
that.
very popular black corporate magazine of fashion,
Right.
black American culture and whatnot. Yeah,
Yeah, but it did do some positive things too. I mean, they had Secretary on the cover in 1959. 1969, they had an issue on the Black Revolution. But the point is that they were able to penetrate many institutions during that time period. Ali Mazrui, who has since passed away, a friend of mine, uh, when he was teaching at the university, maybe it's been over 30 years ago, when I told him this story, about Mazruri's article that was published in the aftermath of the coup, he had met Mazrui. He was teaching, I think, as a visiting scholar at the U of M. He called him on the phone and left a message saying he wanted to discuss his article that was published widely after the overthrow of Nkrumah, and he never got a call back. So it's clear that he's not proud of that legacy, and he went on to host a series on PBS on the history of Africa, which, in my opinion, had problems as well. But like I said, Ghana historically has made a major contribution to African history, whether it was previous to enslavement and colonialism, during the colonial period, in the struggle against colonialism, and after Nkrumah, of course, it's been problematic, but at the same time, his ideas are still very much alive in that country.
fascinating. Well, and just before we bid our audience farewell, I do have to mention this when we talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. So W.E.B. Du Bois, there are sometimes I see this a lot in the online world when you see people talk about him on Twitter, or when you see people talk about him on Facebook, even in the mostly black left wing Facebook groups I'm in. There are some people who denounce W.E.B. Du Bois as this kind of, black misleadership class person, and compare him very negatively to somebody like a Jesse Jackson or an Al Sharpton. But I remember interviewing Jared Ball about this, and he pushed back against this. And then I had Dr. CBS, who's done a very great book about how about the left and the communist left, its very positive relations with Black America, and how anti-communism in the U.S., you cannot separate it from also the anti-blackism, white supremacy, and so forth.
Of course.
So now and she was invited by the International Manifesto Group, which does these superb, online events.
Yeah, out of Manitoba. Yeah.
Yes, and you've been a panel on their
Yeah, two or three times with Dr. Radhika Desai from India. Yeah. And
exactly,
Alan
and
Freeman from Britain. Yeah.
exactly, and so Dr. CBS was on an event that they were doing alongside friends of socialist China, and she was mentioning something about W.E.B. Du Bois and his time in China, and that really, surprised me. And then I asked the question in the chat: was W.E.B. Du Bois a communist? So, because people use the word socialism, and it's people use socialism in a very funny way sometimes. Like, these are the good
Yes.
leftists and these are the bad leftists. If you're a communist, if you're
Right.
and somebody who supports Stalin, and somebody who supports the Eastern European country, you're often considered a Stalinist, and don't talk to those people. So I asked the question: was W.E.B. Du Bois a communist, and what was his idea of advancing left wing revolutions and so forth? And then Dr. CBS responded that yes, W.E.B. Du Bois was indeed a communist, lived in exile in Ghana, did actually support the Chinese Revolution, and went to China to see some of the positive stuff that the revolution that that Chairman Mao was doing. But very important and this is where it gets very interesting. W.E.B. Du Bois, when they came to America, believed in a non-violent revolution, and not the sort of bloody revolution of the Bolsheviks, or what or what China did. So I thought that was very fascinating, because sometimes even the best of the black left completely,
Yeah.
minimizes this about W.E.B. Du Bois. So when you were talking about, W.E.B. Du Bois and his influence on Ghanese affairs and vice versa, I think it's important to mention because I believe in moving beyond anti-communist leftism. That is very important to note that Nkrumah, yes, was a communist, and W.B. Du Bois himself was, was a communist, and even felt very disillusioned with the whole electoral system, the two-party system, and thinking that the Democrats will ever be a revolutionary party that can advance Black liberation and the liberation of all marginalized and working class folks. Any final thoughts you want to say about that before we?
Yes, Du Bois and his wife traveled to China in 1959. Was covered by the New York Times and other publications. He officially joined the Communist Party USA, I believe, in 1961. Towards the end of his life. Some people have criticized him for his opposition to Marcus Garvey, UNIA, during the early 1920s. But if you look at the documents and you go back, it was Garvey who actually attacked Du Bois first and the NAACP first. So they were responding to those attacks. But anyway, both of them, I believe, Garvey and Du Bois, made a major contribution to Pan-Africanism and the national liberation movements worldwide. So I don't want to agree with one and not the other. We have to take the positive elements of all of these tendencies and leaders and organizations to try to synthesize this into a new praxis towards liberation and unity.
Well, fantastic place to fantastic place to end. Well, we were joined on this All Things Africa edition, learning about the history and current affairs of Ghana with our always wonderful returning champion, historian, journalist, Pan-Africanist, leftist, and all-round anti-imperialist in support of all people power movements, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Check out his work and check out all of his appearances on 1+1. Subscribe to both Pan-African Newswire and BAR, Black Agenda Report. Donate generously to them. Don't forget to do the same for 1+1 and share widely all of 1+1's content. Encourage others to like us and again share and donate to help us overcome the Facebook suppression and the right-wing algorithms. The next country we'll be exploring is Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. Join us next week for that. Have a great weekend, folks, and yes, good night and good luck.